Does God care about small places? How can we faithfully serve Christ in a rural context? What is the future of the church in rural America? The Rural Ministry Podcast deals with questions like this and much more in the hopes of bringing practical resources and inspiring stories to help the church flourish in rural communities. Dr. Charlie Cotherman is the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of a rural church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. Join the conversation as we journey into the good things God is doing in small places. All right, well, welcome to another episode of the Rural Ministry Podcast, where we talk about the unique challenges and joys of living and doing ministry in rural places. I'm your host, Garrett Heath, Director of Media and Communications at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College, and I'm joined as usual by my co-host, Dr. Charlie Cotherman. Charlie is the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of Oil City Vineyard Church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. So today we bring you the third installment in our series entitled Raising Leaders. And so far we've had a lot of great conversation around this idea of how we can both kind of identify and develop potential leaders in rural areas and churches where pastors, I think, generally tend to have a difficult time on this front. And joining us today is a really special guest, Dr. Scott Sunquist. Scott is the President of Gordon-Conwell Seminary, Professor of Missiology there. And he also has taught in the past at Fuller Seminary and was at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary for quite a while. And this is kind of where his story began to intersect a bit with yours, Charlie, and even mine a little bit. So, Scott, thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you on the show.
I'm happy to be here. It brings back a lot of history. And I think about leadership training. I didn't just start teaching at Pittsburgh Seminary. I started in Singapore, and I was only 33 years old and didn't have a clue what I was doing, trying to finish my dissertation. So a lot of water under the bridge now, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, well, we're glad you're here. And, it's especially fun for me because, I can remember, those first semesters at seminary, being in your church history classes and missiology, and eventually being kind of in a round table where we would kind of hold each other accountable, reading the word and praying. And you've just been a really important part of even my personal story. So it's fun to have you onto this little podcast we're doing. And I do think you have a lot to say about leadership. And maybe we'll just start there. And I think maybe with your story, if you would be willing to tell us a little bit about your story, maybe you can highlight the places maybe where there was a leader who really made a difference and what that looked like.
But let me take this off track just a little bit, because a couple weeks ago, I got a card from a woman named Hung Tran in Sacramento. And back in 1979, you all remember 1979, I'm sure.
Very well.
My wife and I, we were 23 and 24 years old. We had our daughter who's 9 months old, and we sponsored a widow and 4 children who lived in our house for a year. And the first card that she has written by hand in English, she just sent thanking us for sponsoring her and saving her life, because her husband had fought for the United States in Vietnam. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because often in leadership, you think you're leading people, but they're also leading you. Mm-hmm. Because having them in our house for a year turned our hearts towards Asia. And the next thing you know, about 6 or 8 years later, 10 years later, I'm known as an Asian church historian. I was not heading towards Asia. I had no interest in Asia. Matter of fact, I was planning on going to Latin America. But by inviting them in, trying to be obedient at the moment in responding to the refugee crisis, our little small group invited them in. And I look back and I say, my gracious, thank you that you thanked us for doing that. But you changed our lives. Wow. And consequently, our daughter learned Chinese. We lived in Singapore, and the rest is history. So when it comes to leadership, Charlie, I think about the time we had together at Pittsburgh Seminary. I learned a lot from students at that time. And to this day, I have rhythms of life that were set in place because we started reading the Philokalia together and the Bible together. And I learned that from my son-in-law. So I think it's important to, I guess, in all humility, to realize that part of what shapes us as leaders is the people that we're called to lead. Oh, I was supposed to talk. What was your question? I was supposed to
Yeah,
answer.
well, I almost forgot my question. That was such a great story to start the way. I was just asking kind of about your story. I mean, we hit hardly even the high points in the intro, and
Yeah.
I think it would be good for folks just to hear kind of where you have been, like in a kind of 30,000 foot, and
Yeah.
if there were leaders along the way, which you just spoke to, really. I mean, it sounds like some of them were in surprising places.
Yeah. Yeah. I was born at a very young age, and also one thing about leadership that you might want to mention is that humor can be used in leadership, and or it can be used to destroy leadership. If it's unitive and brings people together, it comes in as a surprise, and all of a sudden, we come together. But we'll get into humor later on if we have time. But first of all, I was raised in a nominal Christian family. We went to church, very faithful about it, but nothing very personal until I was 16 years old. And I was invited into a Bible study that met on Sunday afternoons. And that was the first time I had somebody every week talking about Jesus. So we just went through the Gospels. He told stories. And I was just amazed. I thought that was exciting. Jesus is really exciting. And then after about 2 months, he asked us why we weren't inviting our friends. And I said, we've got a good thing going here. We don't want to bring in, outsiders, because we were like soccer players and basketball players and cheerleaders. And so, we were the in crowd. And then he told us, don't you know what it means to be a Christian? And that was the first time I'd ever thought about that. And he basically said it means you've made a decision to follow Jesus, to make him the center of your life. And that made perfect sense to me, that that's what I needed to do. But then he said, and as long as you haven't answered that question, you've answered no. And I thought that's exactly right. If you haven't yet decided, you've decided no. So I made that decision. Everything changed from there. And then I think that the leaders who really impacted me were that guy who's a Campus Crusade or a Crew staff member. And then when I was in college at the University of North Carolina, it wasn't my soccer coach. It was my intervarsity staff worker who had a great influence on me. And he challenged me. And this is a part of leadership, right? You challenge somebody to the next level. He challenged me to think about, because I was the president of the chapter, to think about intervarsity staff. And I'd never thought about that. But he was very important because he challenged me to really make a sacrificial commitment. And then I'd say the next leader who really had a great impact on me was my advisor at Gordon-Conwell, Dr. Nigel Kerr. And I can't tell you the number of times he said, let's go out and get a cup of coffee and a donut. We'd sit down and talk, and he'd reflect. He made himself available for me. And then from a distance, it was Richard Lovelace, and he impacted me. I had him in class, but his ideas impacted me. Sometimes leadership is ideas, and his ideas about renewal were just phenomenal. They just blew me away. I can still remember preconditions for renewal, primary elements of renewal, secondary elements of renewal, and it's all there in my brain. And when I write church history this day, I have that in the back of my mind. And then the next great person who had a phenomenal influence on me was my advisor, Sam Moffat, whose father was a pioneer missionary in North Korea. And he went, because he was raised in Korea, he knew he couldn't be a missionary in Korea because that was home. So he became a missionary in China. The communists took over, arrested him, and he was kicked out. But anyway, he was a phenomenal leader for me in the way he prayed, the way he asked questions, the way he pushed me, but also the way he listened carefully to me. And again, to this day, I have a picture of him on my file cabinet in my office. And I remember the formative influence of the two of them in leadership and scholarship. So for me, leadership has been scholarship and thinking, as well as being courageous.
Yeah. Wow. That's good. And you guys can't see it right here, but I'm looking up at a photo I have, Scott, of you and me. And some of the same things have been influenced in my life. So I totally understand how there can even be academic models of leadership that are also spiritual and faithful.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Let's take a little bit of a detour. I want to come back to your story later and hear about what lessons you've learned. But you're a historian. I mean, some of your work has been on the earliest Christian church, um, kind of some of the places most of us know much about, even the church in Asia. And I was wondering what lessons you've seen kind of thinking about the history of the church and some of these kind of more obscure parts of the church that we don't know about. What have you learned about leadership by watching the example of these saints that have gone before us?
It's a great question, and something that until you asked it, I didn't really reflect on it that much. But I did my dissertation on a guy named Narsai, and interestingly enough, he ran a seminary that had about 1,000 students. I'm running a seminary that has about 1,000 students. He was doing it around 500 AD, and I'm doing it, 2100. So when I look back at what he did, he set up clear cultural guidelines. The laws and the statutes of Nisibis are basically a faculty or a student handbook. How you're supposed to care for one another, what kind of culture we have, and I have to develop a culture at my seminary. And so some of these things take on different permutations or contextualization, but you have the same concerns. And then I think also in my going through history, I was very influenced by the Reformation, but for different reasons. I was influenced by some of the counter-Reformation people and trying to struggle with what they knew. They had not tended the church very well, but they'd allowed it to become so ossified. And so I take a look at some of those leaders, the Jesuits, for example, and then I take a look at the Reformation renewal in the Low Countries of the sons in what would today be the Netherlands and Flanders and so forth. And that influenced Paris, the University of Paris, because the person who was the dean at the University of Paris had studied with those renewal movements. And who studied at the University of Paris but a guy named Jean Calvin, as well as all the early Jesuit leaders came out of there. And so they're coming out of that same culture, and they have some of the same sensitivities. And so you fast forward to my teaching at Fuller. I had a Singaporean Chinese who did a dissertation on the spiritual formation of John Calvin and the early Jesuits. He's doing a comparison. And how did he pick that up? He just picked it up from studying history with me in Singapore. But then he began to realize that they had the same taproot. And so, I could go on and on about the study, but it's not only the study of the history of great leaders who were thoughtful, deep, spiritually knew scripture, but it's also failures. It's the study of failures in leadership. I did an article on failures in church renewal, and I talk about over-contextualization. Now, there's a mistake that leaders make. They're trying to be relevant and so forth. Think of how much over-contextualization we have in our churches today, and mega churches and so forth. I've been to churches that are very similar to an evening rock concert. And they even give you earplugs when you come in because the music's going to be so loud and you're going to stand up and you're dancing and everything. The same thing you did Friday night when you went to a concert. But what's the message that's being communicated there? So there's over-contextualization, there's under-contextualization. We just take something rigid all through history, and you find that people begin to drop off because it no longer connects with their lives. So no, that's a great question. I think I should write a book on it. But
yeah. Well, that sounds like a good one to write. When I think about some of the examples you just used there are also kind of like how institutions can shape leaders and change things. And that's something we've been trying to think about, because so much of our modern kind of celebrity culture lends itself to kind of like the individual celebrity, right? But like institutions matter, but sometimes institutions can get off track. So even I'm thinking about like in your course, we read Pia Desideria, like pious desire, right? And the kind of reforms coming out of pietism and Hala and places. And like that was from within, like, but they were saying we need to make sure our hearts are in the right place. And that's another reason why institutions like Grove City or like Gordon-Conwell, like institutions matter, but it matters how we tend them, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Can I interrupt? Are you asking a question, or can
No,
I
I'm
interrupt?
I'm making a comment. That's what happens on this podcast. Sometimes I just start
All right.
going off, Scott, but
All
you
right.
can always interrupt.
There's a great book on change, and I think the subtitle is How to Lead in Liminal Times. And one of the elements that she says there is the job of the leader in liminal times, and we are definitely in liminal time now. It is the leader's responsibility to, in a sense, tend the culture, the DNA, the essence of the institution, because you don't know if it's going to go this way or that way. So you got to make sure everybody's kept together. And I got a great example of how God did that in my life, even though I think I failed as a leader, because we were going to make a decision at Gordon-Conwell to move the whole campus downtown. And the board of trustees had voted 100% because we had to save the institution. We had debt. We had to pay off these bills. We had budget concerns every year. So if we sold off the property, we could pay off all that debt and everything. And the board was ready to go. We were looking for property. We were ready to go. And the faculty voted 100% not to move. Now, if I didn't tell you the end of the story, you'd probably think, oh, and that's when Sunquist retired. And he blew it. Okay. But because we had a really good cabinet and a good board of trustees, and the culture was contained in such a way, there was a high level of trust, that when I said, okay, then we won't move, the board of trustees didn't fire me and the faculty didn't vote me off the ship, because we were all in this together and we were thinking through this thing together. And though it was a great embarrassment, we're now in great shape. But it's that whole culture. You can't just tend the board. You can't just tend the faculty, not just your cabinet. There has to be communications and a struggle together. So it's my job, kind of caught in the middle with the board there and the faculty and administration over here. It's my job to make sure we're communicating in healthy ways and keep those strands firm and connected. Once they begin to get snapped, it falls apart. So anyway, that's just kind of an example of how that culture has to be tended carefully, especially in rapid change.
Well, I think it might also be a teachable point for our listeners, because as far as I know, we don't have any other listeners who are running seminaries, though they may be out there. But we do have a good number of listeners who are leading things like churches or even families, right? But especially churches, I'm thinking the kind of communication things are very similar, just on a smaller local level.
Yes.
Where it's like, usually as a pastor, you do have a board or presbyters or something like that. And you have, also you have like the young families who have their own like desires. You have the ones who have been there a long time. You have the outside community. And so part of what I just heard you say, I think, is the communication and relationship building is really important. And I wonder if you could speak to that for the pastor. I think some of the lessons you've learned in the seat you're in actually do have a lot of takeaway for a local pastor. So could you speak to the local pastor about kind of maintaining relationships and communication, what you've learned?
No, I appreciate that question, because I never wanted to be a pastor, but I was told that I needed to be ordained if I was going to be a Presbyterian missionary in Asia. And then lo and behold, I ended up pastoring a church and even planting a new church in Singapore, not in the States. And I'm so glad that I did, because I began to realize I'm training people for the church, and I'd never led a church. And I realized what you just said is absolutely true. So much of it is about communications. And I just did a blog post today, which will be posted next week, called "What is True?" or "What is Truth?" And of course, I quote from Jesus' appearance before Pilate there at the end. But that's the problem we have today, is we don't know what the truth is. So it's a leader's responsibility. I think I've talked to you, Charlie, before about the 4 S's. The leader should have no secrets, no surprises, no subversion, and be fully supportive. Now, when we have secrets, when the leader doesn't communicate what's going on, most people interpret it as a subversion. Oh, he didn't tell us, and now he's doing that. So these are all related. No secrets, no surprises. Because if anything comes up as a surprise, let's say at a elders meeting, a deacons meeting, all of a sudden the pastor says, "Oh, we're going to buy this property next door," He said, what? I didn't know about, where's the money going to come from? Everybody interprets that as subversion. He's trying to get away with something. And so we have to communicate openly. Now, it's impossible to communicate well enough, even though we do it again and again. We send out emails, we send out texts, we have a what I call a president's forum or town hall meeting. Every month I have a town hall meeting because during COVID, I would have them every week because we were having to make new guidelines and finances were different. So it was like 135 people zooming in because we couldn't be together. I said, let's do this every month. So we've been doing it every month now for 6 years. And so at that time, I asked for information from the different campuses, from the Bible division, for alumni relations. And we try to make sure that together as a culture, we're learning how we are and what we are because we're very diverse. Well, the same is true in a church. Even if you have a church of 80 people on Sunday, there's the youth program and there's children and there's somebody sick in the hospital. And we want to be a community and be connected like that. Now, my wife added one more S. Charlie, I thought you'd be interested in this because before I actually sat in the chair as the president, people started saying things about me without knowing me because they didn't have information. And so the fourth S is no slander. It's so easy to slander. If you don't believe me, read the Psalms. It's all over the Psalms how people slander. So I thought that's amazing. David knew what it's like to be a seminary president.
Yeah.
So communications is a key. When the communications isn't there, trust is broken. And trust is a very difficult thing to repair.
Yeah.
Well, and this hasn't really come up in many of our conversations so far in this series, but some of your points kind of reminded me of how we frame even just this loaded word leadership, right? And in our larger culture, so often I think leadership is kind of seen as this position that can kind of get me ahead, and I don't really think of myself as sharing the story of those I'm leading, right? But everything that you've said today is pushing back hard against that. So I didn't know, Scott, if you had any, I don't know, any wisdom on like what in a Christian context for a pastor, for seminary leader, like what is leadership in a Christian context, and how can that speak against this broader understanding and of leadership that lends this cynicism, right? What?
Yeah. I struggle with that because in my blog post every week, I have 8 people read it before I post it because it's so easy to be misunderstood at this time. I have a black man, I have a Brazilian woman, I have one white man, I have a Korean man raised in South America. You see what I'm doing here?
Mm-hmm.
Men, women, different cultures, because they're listing from their contexts. And sometimes everybody says, great. Sometimes I have to find out I need to be sensitive to others. So you have to, first of all, listen to your people and not assume you know them all. And listening to your people, it means many different things. I think for a pastor in a local church, it means you drop in every once in a while in the nursery and you see what's going on there. And you hang out there with the youth that sometimes, and you visit in the hospital. You have to know the people well to build that kind of trust. At Gordon-Conwell, about 4 mornings a week, I go into the cafeteria, and then I go into the kitchen, and I say hello to the ladies in the kitchen. I get a cup of coffee. I walk down to see who's in the office by 8 o'clock and who's not in the office at 8 o'clock. No, I'm just checking out when they come in and say hello, welcome to the day. Sometimes I pray with them. And if somebody said, I say, how you doing? They say, well, I'm doing all right. I say, well, that's not good. What's not going well? So I've learned, and I just recently, I hate to say this, but it wasn't until I was about 70 years old that I learned to listen carefully when somebody says, how you doing? So it's very, very important to listen carefully to people and know that. I think that's the first thing for a Christian leader, is to know their sheep. The second thing I would say that's very important is to remember that you do have to lead, and you will not make everybody happy. And so you want to spend a lot of time in silence and prayer and thinking about, and my job has been extremely difficult because of so many issues in the broader culture has been identified by one writer. It's an age of chronic anxiety, not just anxiety, but chronic anxiety. And so people easily fly off the handle, they get angry, they make assumptions. And when we hear partial information, we fill in the rest with something negative 90% of the time. That's our fallen nature. If somebody comes in with a bruise on their arm or their leg or they turn their ankle, it's like we almost assume his wife beat her, as opposed to she really fell down the steps. So we kind of assume the negative. So we have to be very careful in helping people to see what's positive, right, and true. But then we make that decision. We take the hit, and then we try to explain. And some people will never understand. So if you're waiting to lead to make sure everybody supports you, you will never lead. And certainly, Jesus was a leader, and he got killed for it.
Yeah.
So those are just some of the things that come off the mind right away, because I've had to make a lot of tough decisions. And two things people have said. One is you're very open and candid about what the problems are. I came in and announced what our debt was. I announced the problems we had in our budget. I've announced that we have to reduce the size of the faculty and that sort of thing. And then once I had to announce that everybody was going to have to take a cut in their salary for 3 months so that we could pay our bills. Now that was awful. The end of my first year. But guess what? I did not have one email of complaint, because we had a good board of trustees that communicated well, a good cabinet, and we're all on the same page. And we knew we were doing this for the students and for the future of the school. And so you have to be courageous, and you have to be attentive, and you have to be humble, and you have to really seek the truth. And really drill down to find out what the truth is.
Yeah. Wow. What a story. One of the things that strikes me, as you're training up at Gordon-Conwell, and really this has been most of your life, you've been training the next generation of leaders. I wonder what you see, as you've watched them mature and you've observed from the outside, but also you've experienced it. Like, what does it take to be faithful over the long haul, right? So you just said you're 70-ish, like that's a lot of years in leadership. And we've seen lots of people come and go as leaders in various ways, and I'm sure over the course of the year, some of your students have been faithful for decades and some have had struggles.
Yeah.
So, like, what have you seen in your own life or in the life of those that you've worked with? Like, what does it take to be the kind of leader, whatever level we're leading at, that's faithful over the long haul?
Well, I'm going to answer that, and then I want to hear from some of your listeners if they have better advice, because I've been asking the same question. We've had some churches divide that had a lot of staff, and our own alumni argue and then split. And I think, what is with that? We never taught that. We taught humility, we taught self-sacrifice, we taught people to take up their cross daily. If you take up your cross, that means you die to self, you die to your own desires. And so what's going on there? That you have to defend yourself and defend your own wisdom over that of the church in general. So I spoke to a Thriving in Ministry group at the seminary last week, and I was talking about this very thing. And we talked about a number of things. One is the way we teach and the way we do formation in our classes, and we have a life together model where they meet with faculty and together for like 2 or 3 years, and they disciple others. And in that, a lot of it is being very candid and open and learning to pray and support one another. And we decided that that's an important foundation. And I actually talked to one of our faculty members about, before you leave seminary, you go ahead and have 3 or 4 people that you're going to covenant with for the next 10 years to connect every month through Zoom or in person, because you're going to need it. And that's just facing the fact that you don't go it alone. Now, the first sentence in any leadership course should be the following: welcome to this course in leadership. The one thing you should know is leadership is very lonely. It's true. It is. I go on that campus, I walk around. If I blow it, the seminary dies. And I know that everybody there is a little suspicious of me because they know I could fire them. Now, that's just the way it is in an organization. So it's very lonely. And my second sentence after that is, but that's okay,
Mm.
because Jesus should be enough.
Mm.
And so I have spent so much more time in silence and prayer. And I went out and walked this morning for about an hour and a half right before the temperature drops terribly, and just praying and drawing closer to Christ, because I have so many things going on, starting a PhD program, selling apartments, teaching a class in the fall, starting a new center. I mean, it goes like this. So I spend time with Jesus, and I listen, and I talk to him about it. And I didn't do that when I was younger, but I hope and pray that everybody realizes walking closely with Jesus Christ and listening to him and having accountability people that no matter what, they will be with you. A friend of mine said, "Do you have any real friends?" And you know what I said? I said maybe two or three. And I mean, that's a real close friend. That, as this friend of mine said, it's like if you knock on their door and you have nothing in your hands, they'll take you in. Even if you're going to be going to prison, they're there with you. And so a leader needs a few people like that, not many. And for me, of course, my best friend is my wife. 50 years of marriage this coming summer, and and she's very supportive. She listens carefully. We're in this together. She doesn't say, "I don't want to hear about it." Uh, she'll be hurt by some of the things that people said, and we pray about it together. She's the first person who reads my blog post every week before I send it to anybody else. So the high level of trust and closeness. And if you're single, then you've got two or three really close friends who are the same way. But I'll tell you, the stress, the anxiety that there is out there, we need that. And then we need, in all humility, to realize that, well, let me tell you this. This is what all of our grandkids can answer this question, all right? I say, Gloria, why do people get angry? Because they don't get their own way, Grandpa. And
Mm.
that's it. And then Mark the ascetic in the early church, it comes from the church fathers. He says, why in the world do we think we should get our own way when we pray, thy kingdom come
Mm.
on earth as it is in heaven, thy will be done. And so that's a matter of contentment.
Mm.
In the midst of all that, we're content. Jesus is enough, no matter what the situation. I mean, I'm content. I know that we're going to have a snowstorm. I have to cancel my flight. I might be 2 days late. It's okay.
Yeah. Wow. That's good. And, maybe part of what I'm hearing is just the difference where what we often, I think, we can affirm thy will be done, thy kingdom come
Yeah.
in our words, and maybe even fool ourselves in our mind. But unless we spend time with Jesus to root it out of our hearts,
Mm-hmm.
that selfishness is deep seated.
Yep. We just don't realize how those desires that are so bent keep coming back. Now, I'm a Presbyterian, but I'm going to sound a little Pentecostal here. That's where the demons provoke. They provoke our desires. And if it's a desire for an image, if it's a desire for possessing something, a desire for a position, and that's why we have to continually confess our sins, and then we take away the power that those demons have over us.
It's good. Well, I think that's about all the time we have. I want to give you a chance to just give one or two words. I know you have, even in your pocket, you have easy reference like 10 tips for leaders. So there might be one that you didn't hit today. I want to give you a chance to give one more word, but I also want to tell our listeners that if you like listening to what Scott has to say, and I think he has a lot more to say, you should come to our conference this September, where he will be speaking, the Center for Rural Ministry Conference at Grove City College, the weekend after Labor Day, so the second weekend of September. Make your plans for that, and we have stuff on our website about it. But yeah, I don't know, Scott, if you could just leave us with a word or two for that pastor out there who's trying to lead in the thick of it right now,
Yeah.
what would you tell him?
It's interesting. It might sound very simplistic here, but for the last 20, 25 years, every day, every morning, I get up between 5 and 5:30, and the rhythm will form your character. Rhythm will form virtues in your life. If you don't have the rhythms, forget it. So my rhythm, I could say it was 50 years, but it's only been about 20 or 25. Take a shower, cup of coffee, read 2 chapters of the Old Testament, read one Psalm, read one chapter of the New Testament, read one page of the Philokalia, um, or some other spiritual writing, but usually it's from the early church fathers. Every single day, I read extensively and I meditate intensively. So today I read 2 chapters of Genesis. It's the 23rd day of the year, I think. Yeah. I read Psalm 23, and then I'm reading from Matthew 23. And so what am I thinking on today? I'm thinking about leadership. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me by still waters. He restores my soul. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You pour oil on my head. You anoint my head. My cup overflows. Surely mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So I made sure that I had memorized it again, and I'm meditating on it. If there's anything leaders need, they need to be so full of Scripture that in the midst of crisis or anger, God uses that Scripture, brings up, remember this, Scott? Yes. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. And that comes back to us when we're angry. So that's the only thing I would say. Rhythms to form virtues involving Scripture.
Yeah. You know what's amazing about that is that it's easy to think, oh, someone's leading like a seminary or, a seminary with 1,000 students. They must have this like really slick leadership manual. They must really have like these things I don't have. And I need to get a life coach and figure it out and like do all this stuff. But what you just said is the stuff we tell new Christians to do. It is the old paths are still the good paths, kind of thing. But it's a matter of walking them every day. So thank you for reminding us that. Thank you for your leadership. I can't wait to have you on campus this fall. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. It gave me an opportunity to think about what in the world I'm doing. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we really appreciate it, Scott. So profound and so simple all at once, which is how the best things are in life. But I think that's a wrap for this week's episode. We hope this conversation has provided you with encouragement, insight, maybe even a practical idea for your own ministry context. I know it has for me. The Rural Ministry Podcast is part of the good work being done at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College. If you found this podcast helpful, there are a few free things you can do to help us out. First, you can share this episode with a friend or colleague who might benefit from it. Second, you can leave us a review on your favorite platform. This helps more people discover the show. And lastly, you can leave us a comment or suggestion on the episode page over at the Center for Rural Ministry YouTube channel. We hope to get some good conversation started over there as well. Thanks again for listening, and you can learn more about our mission by visiting www.ruralministry.org. Have a great week.